Hello everyone, I am Laura Emery and I'm going to talk about my PhD research, which is on the orientation process of newly arrived migrant students in Flemish secondary education. I'm going to give a brief overview of my research by using a few drawings. My research is about newly arrived migrant students in secondary education. These are young people aged between 12 and 18 years old who have just arrived in Flanders and need to find a place in the Flemish education system. It is a very diverse group of pupils based on age, but also socioeconomic background and nationality, and also migration motivation. It includes children whose parents applied for asylum in Belgium, children who moved because of their parents' employment situation, or children who came to Belgium in the context of family reunification, for example. Little research has been done on this group of pupils. It is therefore a relatively small group of pupils. However, at the start of my research in 2015, we saw a doubling of the amount of newly arrived migrant students in secondary education because of the increased influx of people from Afghanistan and Syria seeking asylum in Belgium. We went from 2,500 pupils coming into our education system every year to 5,000 new students every year. Now, at the end of my research, we also see an influx from people from Ukraine, so the numbers are even higher. What was already known at the start of my research is that this group of students have an increased risk of redoing their year and of dropping out early. Furthermore, they are overrepresented in vocational education. More than half of newly arrived migrant students go on to vocational education after they were in reception education. While for other pupils, this is less than a fourth of all students. It is remarkable that such a diverse group of pupils, who are often highly motivated and ambitious, have such an homogeneous practical orientation. So the main research question of my research is how does the orientation process of newly arrived migrant students in Flemish education occur? While psychologists or pedagogues would rather answer this question by looking at individual teachers and pupils, I tried to study the system in which teachers and pupils participate. In my opinion, it is at the system level that the answers can be found for problems that crop up in the orientation of newly arrived migrant students. In answering this question, it is important to get a picture or a view on how secondary education is organized. However, this is a complex matter. For newcomers, it can even seem like a real maze. Given the complexity of the education system, it is logical that newly arrived migrant students are not immediately included in the regular system. After all, it would require them to make a study choice without any knowledge of the options available to them. They therefore first follow a separate form of education, namely reception education. Here they start learning Dutch, and they and their parents are guided by teachers in making a study choice. Newly arrived migrant students not only have to find their way through this maze, but also acquire new knowledge and skills. These are symbolized in this presentation by playing cards, some of which you can already see in this student's hands. With these cards, they have to play the educational game and thus take a place in the educational field. To learn more about the orientation process of newly arrived migrant students, mountains of data were collected. Spread over 6 years, I interviewed students at the end of their school career who were once in reception education. I made weekly observations in 2 reception education schools, created a data set with information on the orientation of 4 generations of students that used to go to one of the schools. And I visited 14 pupils at home for a group interview with their families. Lastly, I also observed during admission councils, where teachers decide whether students can be allowed in a certain study option. In total, pupils and teachers from 25 different schools were involved in the study. Different methods were were deliberately used, and teachers, as well as parents and pupils, were involved in the study. In this way, I got a view of the orientation process of newly arrived migrant students from different perspectives. These data led to 4 studies. In each study, one aspect of the orientation process is discussed. For the first study, I used interviews with pupils at the end of secondary education. These pupils who had moved onto either the most academic track or the most vocational track. Because though the majority move on to vocational tracks, there are pupils who move on to the most academic track, and I was wondering what the difference is between those 2 groups of pupils. From talking to the students about their school careers, it became clear that they differed on specific expressions of cultural capital. Cultural capital is a concept central to Pierre Bourdieu's work. Researchers have often tried to measure it by asking, for example, how often someone participates in cultural activities such as visiting a museum, or the number of books people had on their bookshelves at home. This would give an indication of the environment in which children grow up. However, more recent research by Annette Larue and Jessica Calarco give it an interpretation that I think is also closer to the subtle elaboration of the concept that Bourdieu himself had in mind, namely knowledge and behavior that children are taught through their parents and their environment, and that helps them maneuver in institutions such as education. In this, I saw clear differences between pupils who progress to more academic tracks and made a transition to the most academic track, and the ones that transitioned to the vocational track. First, ISO students, or students who transitioned to the most academic track, showed during their interview that they had more strategic knowledge about the education system. They talked about how quickly they grasped the system of ability groups in reception education, how the whole system was organized, and especially their own position within the system and their options for transitioning, so that they really quickly had an idea of where they were in the whole system and how to maneuver or how to find information to maneuver the system. They also had more formal knowledge on the education system with all the procedures and the legal requirements. For instance, one of the students knew that when changing schools, the new teachers could not stop him from enrolling in a certain study option because he had received an A certificate, which means that he can enter any study option in the most academic track. And he knew that very well, and that's how he managed to change schools successfully. They also told me that through people in their network who had been in Belgium for longer, they got more informal information as well. Informal information about schooling, for instance, the reputation of schools, study options, how much support certain schools would give to newly arrived migrant students. Important information when you're making a study choice, and information that mostly students in the most academic track showed in their stories compared to students who transition to more vocational tracks. The second element of cultural capital that I saw in the stories of students who went to the most academic track was a sense of entitlement, which means that they more often enforced their right to equal education opportunities. They more often defended themselves and their educational rights, and they knew how to do so. They requested and obtained extra support from teachers. For example, some were allowed to take their exams in a separate room where they could ask questions without disturbing the other students. They also more often went against opinions of teachers and principals on what was a suitable choice for them to study. They more often actively claimed their place in the education system because they could engage in dialogue with authority figures in education, such as teachers and principals. They considered their advice as one element to take into account in their study choice, amongst others. In comparison, the study choices of students who transition to BESO or the more vocational tracks seem to be more often based on coincidences rather than strategic knowledge. For example, one of the students chose a field of study because her friend was doing the same field. Their sense of entitlement was also lower. For instance, they often felt uncomfortable when they had many questions during class. So in the end, they stopped asking questions. Furthermore, teachers' advice often played a decisive role amongst these students. Strategic knowledge about the education system and a sense of entitlement can be linked to actions mastered mainly by the middle and upper classes. Again, we see that pupils who progressed to ISO or more academic study options more often have more parents that are educated, highly educated, who are also more often in a better economic situation. Pupils who moved on to ISO, the more academic track, have different action strategies, which makes their orientation different. I think it's important that teachers are aware of these mechanisms because cultural capital is often overseen aspect of the orientation process of newly arrived migrant students, but can play an important role. The second study zooms in on the use of ability groups in reception education. Not all schools that organize reception education work with ability groups, but when a school has enough pupils to make several classes, this is often used. It is how it happened in the 2 schools where I went to observe weekly. During the first weeks of the reception year, pupils are still randomly mixed together in class groups. During this period, teachers observe the pupils in class, try to find out their prior education, do small tests on vocabulary that they learn in the first weeks, and have the whole group of reception education pupils take a test that means to assess their math level and also assess how quickly pupils will pick up Dutch. That's what they try to assess. With this data, then they try to regroup the pupils across classes according to their general ability. There are some observations to be made here. First, teachers' observations are influenced by elements that are not directly relevant to estimating pupils' general abilities. And these are also elements that we discussed when I talked about cultural capital. For instance, whether pupils can appropriately show interest and motivation for a subject matter, or whether the student plays piano. Such elements sometimes play a role in how pupils are assessed, and by valuing students by these cultural capital expressions, students who are from a higher socioeconomic status have more chance of getting assigned to a higher ability group than other students. Second, a language acquisition is not a good indication of a student's overall academic ability. Furthermore, correctly evaluating the acquisition of Dutch on just a few weeks is not possible. Language acquisition takes years. It proceeds whimsical with relapses and sudden leaps forward and is a very individual process. It proceeds differently for everyone. Language acquisition can therefore only be evaluated correctly by monitoring the process over a long period of time. And also by realizing that language acquisition takes a long time, especially when you need to acquire a very academic, very abstract level of language. Further, to evaluate it correctly, you also need to cover different aspects of language acquisition, and you have to take into account the knowledge of other languages too. Thus, we can already question the criteria for classifying learners in this way, but we can also look further to what the implications are for this classification. Because immediately attached to these ability groups are expectations about pupils' orientation options. Students in the highest level group are thereby assessed as possible candidates for more academic fields of study for students in lower level groups, it is seen as more realistic to move on to more practical options. To give pupils the best preparation for their transition options, they are prepared differently in the different ability groups. Pupils in the highest groups already receive material from subjects they will receive in academic fields of study, such as geography or French, and the pupils in other level groups ability groups are more likely to be taught more practical knowledge. The teaching methods in the highest ability group also are more in line with the teaching methods in academic studies. Further, by grouping students who are the fastest in their language acquisition, students who make slower progress have less opportunity to interact with these fast learners. However, this would provide a rich learning environment for their language acquisition. Because of the differences in preparation between the level groups, expectations about pupils' orientation options throughout the year are slowly facilitated by the different approaches within the ability groups. But even apart from, for instance, the level of Dutch that pupils achieve at the end of reception education, we see that in the quantitative analysis that the level group or ability group in which students are placed at the beginning of the school year impacts their transition to regular education. So since many reception education pupils have the ambition to progress to more academic fields of study, but it's only seen realistic for those who are in the highest ability groups, there is a large group of pupils whose academic ambitions need to be cooled out. A concept that is also used in other educational contexts, but that I looked at in study 3, in how this is happening in reception education. We see that teachers consciously and unconsciously give small signals to the group of learners of which the academic ambitions are seen as unrealistic. And by giving these signals, learners will quietly adjust their ambitions in one way. The teachers stress how difficult academic fields of study will be for them and how much they will have to work to succeed in them. At the same time, they will emphasize the value of practical fields of study and pre-select options that they believe are more suitable for the students. They do this out of concern that students will not succeed in their new study option otherwise. And in doing so, they also respond to the low level of support that most newly arrived migrant students receive after they leave reception education and go to the regular education. They want teachers want pupils to do well and have a success experience. They also share this feeling with the pupils and their parents. So this conservative way of advising the students is always done out of good intentions, but is a way of cooling out the academic ambitions of students in reception education. Students and their parents often rely heavily on teachers' advice, so they often follow it. And that in that way we can understand how students who are very ambitious, academic ambition in the beginning when they arrive in reception education, but choose another pathway, more practical way when they transition to regular education, because they are made aware that their more academic ambitions were not realistic due to many factors that are actually happening in regular education. To understand why reception education pupils is so strongly influenced by this logic of the regular education, in study 4 I went back to the broader picture of the whole education system or the education field. And we already saw that newly arrived migrant students are prepared to play the educational game in reception education. They gather different assets in the process. We also see that reception education is on the edge of the field. It occupies a small subordinate place. This manifests itself in three aspects when we study the educational field. First, the characteristics of the teachers in reception education show their weaker position in the power balances in the field. They are often younger teachers, more often female, and less often they have a stable position within the schools. They are also less likely to have received specialized training to teach newly arrived migrant students. So in situations of negotiation with regular teachers, you can see by these characteristics that often they won't have the most powerful position to actually lay some way on what is decided. Secondly, the characteristics of pupils. Compared to regular education pupils, newly arrived migrant students are more often have a lower socioeconomic status and live in neighborhoods with more school deprivation. But also in the organization of the transition from reception education to regular education, we see that there's an imbalance of power. It is remarkable that even after the transition of students from reception education to regular education, it's actually the teacher from reception education that is still responsible for the pupil. If he needs to be reorientated, it's still reception education that is responsible. If his well-being of the students is not good, it's still it's always like the responsibility is still at reception education, while after 3 weeks after the transition, it's actually the regular teachers who have the decisional power to decide if the student is in the right study option or not. So there we see an imbalance between responsibility and the decisional power. There's no formal way of regular education or show regular education what their responsibility is in integrating these students, in supporting them, in allowing adjustments in their program so that they can succeed in the new study option. None of this responsibility on the side of regular education is today made formal in one way or another, while the responsibility is more at the reception education side, but they have less power or they're in a less stronger position. Furthermore, the teachers from reception education know the student better, have seen the evolution the student has made in reception education, while regular education teachers mostly have another group of comparison. They compare the newly arrived migrant students to the regular students in their class, and when you compare to those students, it's only normal that reception education students or newly arrived migrant students appear weaker than the other students, while this change in perspective jeopardizes their educational chances. While we further study this field and this maze, we also see a ghost that symbolizes something that Bourdieu calls doxa, and it actually stands for assumptions underlying the field and shaping the field that no one questions. And I try to pinpoint some of them. First, there is the low academic expectations that prevail towards newly arrived migrant students. So the focus is on their barriers, the barriers they have to overcome, and it underestimates their strengths and their resilience. The second assumption is that teaching Dutch is a task exclusively for reception education. And mastering Dutch is like a condition for participating in regular education. However, it is untenable because research shows that acquiring a new language at the abstract level required in secondary education takes 5 to 7 years. A third assumption that is not questioned today, but is questionable, is that regular education teachers have the idea that they should treat all pupils equal, and that teaching homogeneous groups is better. However, treating pupils equally does not lead to equal educational opportunities, and making homogeneous groups even deprives specific groups of pupils of opportunities. The fourth assumption is that teachers feel they are solely responsible for how they teach and what happens in the classroom. However, it is through continuous evaluation and learning together that teachers become stronger. To address this spirit of underlying assumptions, however, we need to do more than look at individual teachers. Structural adjustments need to be made. The playing field needs to be redrawn. And I have a few suggestions on how this can be done. First, reception education should be considered more as a beginning of a support system that continues until the end of the school career. Secondly, reception education should be more integrated into regular education. After a short period of full-time reception education, there may therefore be a period in which pupils gradually participate in classes in regular education. This already happens occasionally for pupils in the highest ability groups, but this practice could be extended to all reception education pupils, or schools can find a way where the pupils of the different education forms, reception education, regular education, more often interact, do activities together. That would already be a great start. Third, reception education teachers and regular teachers should jointly draw up a support plan for pupils so that continuous support is guaranteed. Structural cooperation between reception education teachers and regular teachers would bring enormous professionalization opportunities. Teachers would want to structurally scrutinize their teaching practice together to cater for multilingual pupils will see education improve for all their students. Furthermore, newly arrived migrant students do not arrive empty-handed. They already have assets we can use in the educational game. They already have knowledge and already speak one or more or several languages. These can be a stepping stone to learning in the Flemish education system. After all, when learning a new language, you build on the languages you already know. Therefore, as a teacher, you don't have to start studying all languages and cultures. Learning how to use the knowledge pupils bring to the classroom can already be very effective. That way, heterogeneous class groups are beneficial, and there is no need to sort and select anxiously in order to obtain homogeneous groups. Finally, the core of the orientation process is the study choice of pupils and their parents. Involving them, informing them, as well as being open about the education system seems to me essential for the orientation process. This was a small overview of my research. I hope it was enlightening.